Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're here for the first time or are visiting, my name is Zanele. I'm going to jump straight into it. So we've been talking a lot about this GCC, Government Certificate of Competency. Still a lot of questions coming in around what is this GCC? I'm an aspiring engineer. Do I need to get this GCC? Who needs to have the Government Certificate of Competency? For me to be a successful engineer, does it mean without one I cannot be successful? Does it mean that if I don't have the GCC certificate that I cannot be appointed as a GMR 2.1 in my workplace? So I'm going to answer some of those questions by going through where the GCC actually emanates from. The GMR 2.1 appointment, which is under the General Machinery Regulation section or subsection 2.1. I'm going to try to unpack it and dissect it and simplify it, in fact even oversimplify it, so that everyone who's watching this channel, someone who just wants to know more or less what does the law actually say about this GMR2, that they understand. If you're wanting to read in a lot more detail, then by all means have a look at the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations. I've also created prior videos around the GMR 2.1, but this particular video is there to simplify some of the concepts that are still being questioned and where there may be ambiguity or lack of clarity. One of the important things to remember to note is that the GMR2, even this GCC, is very essential and critical, especially from a safety point of view. So the safety of machinery, but more so to keep people safe. So any person or any engineer, and many of us that are either studying to be artisans, technicians, or engineers, have been told, not only through our institutions or tertiary, but through the frameworks and the programs that we're part of, that our key role is, number one, yes, solving problems, but being responsible to people and to society. Similarly, someone who holds a position of authority on equipment or who's got the responsibility to keep people safe actually has a lot of trust and responsibility and accountability placed on their shoulders. So it's very important that not only does one understand what the requirements are, but also where you need to draw information from or draw resources from or pull from to get the necessary support so you're successful. Ultimately, as an engineer, you don't work in a silo, you work with a combination of people and a lot of moving parts, excuse the pun, but a lot of moving and changing dynamics within your working environment. So it is important that you also recognize the roles that everyone else is meant to play for them to also stay safe. Having said that, you guys know that there's an Occupational Health and Safety Act and there are regulations within that act. So under the General Machinery Regulations, there are separate subsections within the GMR or General Machinery Regulations. The first section, and this is true for all sections within the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations, the first subsection is always definitions. So they'll define what competent person means, they'll define what an elevator means according to the regulation, what an escalator means according to the regulation, what a certificated engineer is. So every subsection or first subsection is usually definitions. And definitions are as important as the rest of the subsections because whatever's then stipulated in the rest of the subsections will refer to the definitions. So if they refer to the competent person, you would then need to go back to the definitions on what defines or what constitutes a competent person according to the regulation. Sub-regulation 2 is around supervision of machinery. So whenever they say someone is appointed as a GMR 2 point whatever, they're essentially saying that someone is appointed under the General Machinery Regulations under subsection 2. So GMR 2. So under this GMR 2 or subsection 2, then you get the different requirements stipulated when what is applicable in what circumstance or what situation. 2.1, in summary, the law basically says an employer or user of machineries will designate in writing a person to supervise this equipment so that machinery is in good working conditions and people are kept safe. Find that with a lot of the requirements, they also refer to the inspector or chief inspector who can override or impose over and above what is regulated or what is stipulated for an employer to do, or something that somewhat deviates from the normal status quo. So in 2.2, the law then states that an inspector may impose for the employer to appoint more than one person to supervise machinery. 2.3 then says that the person that the employer appoints under 2.1. So we've mentioned that in 2.1, user of machinery or employer must appoint a person, right? 2.3 then says this person that is appointed must be a competent person. This then takes us back to the definitions because competent person is defined in the definitions and there's a different competent person A, a different competent person B, a different competent person C, and D. So there's 4 classes of what a competent person is. Going back to the definitions of who is this competent person. Competent person A is a person who would have completed their apprenticeship in an engineering trade or has had at least 5 years experience in operations and in maintenance in that particular environment that they would then be deemed to be competent in. So if I were to describe this individual, someone who would have completed their apprenticeship and is an artisan, who's had their trade, who's had experience within a maintenance or an operational environment, this would then more or less describe what a competent person A is. Competent person B is someone who would have completed their diploma in either the mechanical field or electrotechnical heavy current and who would have obtained either a T3 or an N5 or higher. Over and above that, this individual must have gained at least 2 years experience in an operational or maintenance type environment of a particular machinery or category of machinery that they would then be held accountable to be competent over. Competent person C is a graduate engineer who's had at least 2 years experience and has also passed the law or act and regulations exam. And competent person D is your certificated engineer. This is a person who's got their GCC. So they would have passed the law exam and the factories exam after having all their years of experience, which is issued by the Department of Labor. So having said that, the reason why this is important is because sub-regulation 4 then goes further to say, so of the different conditions in your operation and your facility, there is a certain threshold that would allow for competent person A to be the one that's appointed, competent person B, C, and D to be appointed under subsection 2.1. So if the power generated on your site, this includes steam generation for your processing equipment and processing plants. If it is between 1,200 kilowatts and 3,000 kilowatts, so if it's less than 3,000 kilowatts, but more than 1,200 kilowatts, then competent person B, C, and D are appointed. So this is an individual with a diploma, the graduate, or the certificated engineer. If the sum of that power generated is more than 3,000 kilowatts, then only competent person C and D can be appointed. So only the graduate who's passed the law exam or your certificated engineer may be deemed the competent person or appointed as the competent person to look after that facility. However, if the maximum demand over a continuous 30-minute period is less than 3,000 kVA, competent person A, who's also registered as an installation electrician, would then be sufficient as a person who can be appointed as the competent person. But if the maximum demand is between 3,000 kVA and 10,000 kVA, then competent person B, C, and D then come into play. Then one of those would be the ones appointed as the competent person for that particular facility. Lastly, if the demand exceeds 10,000 kVA, only competent person C and D may be appointed as the competent person for that facility. Subsection 6 goes further to say the chief inspector, he may then come around to the employer and say, actually, you can appoint that person A, B, C, or D for this particular facility. One of the things that teams tend to forget about is that the GMR 2.1 can have people to a system that are also appointed. And this is the provision that's made under subsection 7, right? And this says that an employer can appoint one or more people to then support and assist the GMR 2.1. These individuals would then be appointed as GMR 2.7 because under sub-regulation 2.7. It's important to note, as much as in the definitions, it highlights, stipulates, or describes the competent person. But it's also important to remember that a facility can't have someone appointed as a GMR 2.1 or appointed as a GMR 2.7 in one facility and assume that it covers another facility. So you may apply at a particular address, and because a walkway is shared or it's right next door to each other, assume that that person is also responsible or can be accountable for the other facility next door. So a person can't be designated unless, with approval from the inspector, cannot be appointed unless of where they are designated. 2.9 is an important part to also be compliant with the law, because you would have done the big job of having or hiring the competent person in your facility, or you might be the competent person in your facility. You might have the right person based on the power generated and the power distributed. But if you don't comply to 2.9, then it's not recognized necessarily by law. Because 2.9 then says, for a particular rating of a site, you need to send it in writing to the department. So don't only have your letter of appointments filed, but you must also send it to your divisional inspector to make sure that it is recognized and they log that this facility has a competent person. This is the appointment letter that they've then submitted. Note that this submission is not for all facilities. So this is important. So it's important to note that this requirement is for facilities or sites that generate more than 1,200 kilowatts or more than 3,000 kVA. So if your site generates less than 1,200, so call it 900 kilowatts, then you're not obligated or obliged by law to then send your appointment letter to the department. However, if you're 1,200 and more, or 3,000 kVA and more, then the expectation is that this appointment letter is forwarded to the department for it to be recognized. So for elevators and escalators and electrical installations in shops or in offices, there isn't a requirement for an individual to appoint a person, but under 10B, an instructor may direct a facility or an employer to appoint a person under the regulations. The world is very dynamic, and there are certain circumstances that make it very difficult for facilities or organizations to have this implemented in the way that is prescribed by the law. So exemptions can be granted, but you would need to apply for an exemption for your particular facility. There are requirements that you must meet for that exemption to then be approved by the department. So the 6 things that are required is why you're applying for an exemption. So what are the grounds are you applying for an exemption? How many people work at your facility? So how many people are under your employment, and how many people would potentially be at risk? What type of work do you do? So what is your operation about? What are you producing? What are you making? What are you repairing? What are you designing? What does your facility or operation actually do? How many accidents or injuries have you had in the last 3 years in this particular facility or operation? They also want to see the safety management system that you've got in place. And lastly, there are other particulars that the chief inspector may then ask for them to get a full understanding of the type of operation and facility, the level of risk at this particular facility, and if that exemption can be granted. So last but not least, under General Machinery Regulations 2, so 2.12 says, no employer or no facility shall go without a designation of a competent person for more than 1 month in a continuous 6-month period. So it's very tight timelines. So you cannot go without having designated a person for 1 month period in a continuous 6-month or consecutive continuous 6-month period. Especially when you look at the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it speaks about reasonably practicable. So even in this clause, it says where it's not practicable to comply with that requirement, whether it is because of emergencies or because of a natural disaster or because of significant cost implications, which would be quite rare if it's a cost requirement, especially for safety. Cost shouldn't be too much of an issue. But if it is not practicable for a facility to then comply with this requirement, competent person A may be designated or appointed during this time that it is not practicable. What is really helpful about safety is that requirements are out there, the law is stipulated and it's clear, and it's actually quite detailed on what the requirements are. Some aspects might come across as a bit ambiguous, but the most important part is whatever is stipulated or written down, you go back to your facility and see practically if it is applied. It's one of the best ways to remember what is in the Occupational Health and Safety Act or what is in one of the regulations. In the next video, I'll talk about the General Machinery Regulations Section 3, which speaks about machine guarding. Let me know in the comments which class of competent person is appointed under GMR 2.1 in your facility, and share this video with anyone who you think might find it useful. Be a positive influence. Sharp.